But in keeping with the regional theme, we have a presentation from Patrice McCarthy, the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education, association attorney. Patrice has been with CABE 35 years. Oh. She's been with CABE for 35 years. She has also been the chair of the Council of School Board Attorneys. She routinely and regularly presents at the National School Board Association's annual meeting. In addition to all of that, she's a good friend. And like I said, keeping with the regional theme, she's going to go over some of the policies around Sandy Hook. Again, that's your responsibility primarily is policy development and following through on that. And this is a great resource. You may want to take what you hear from Patrice today and sit down with your school attorney and go over what your policies are in terms of student safety, involving active shooters and other potential threats. So Patrice, without further ado.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I really commend Tim and the officers for putting together a program that incorporates the views of law enforcement, of those of us that work with school committees and school board members on a daily basis, and the community perspective. And I think because of that, you're going to hear some overlap, and I think that's a very good thing because the message is very consistent in terms of some of the things that you need to consider as you develop policies and as you support your administration in developing plans. You have a separate packet, the blue Connecticut folder, and that has a somewhat larger type version of the PowerPoint presentation, as well as some sample policies from Connecticut. And so I'm going to go through the PowerPoint fairly quickly, as long as I make sure I advance the slide appropriately. There we go. And then I'll use the policies not because you want to adapt them completely for Rhode Island, but as a way to talk through some of the issues that are very much your responsibility as the policymakers. So to begin with, it's critical that you look at your emergency management plans on a regular basis, and you heard that from the captain earlier. You also heard him make very clear that plans are not necessarily things that you are going to be making public. Policies are public documents. So what you put in your policies are going to be somewhat more general, will identify issues that should be included in an emergency plan, but won't go into detail as to what the plan consists of. Because as much as your community wants to know all the details, this is one of those cases where knowing all the details is not in their best interest, and posting an emergency plan on your website is not in the best interest of your students and staff. Because the people that are looking to do harm will go there and know exactly what your protocols are. And the captain certainly talked about that. It's also critical that you develop an all hazards approach. We can't respond to the tragedy that happened yesterday. We have to look at the bigger picture and make sure that we're not just thinking about intruders and active shooters, but natural disasters, things that happen on the athletic fields, things that happen on school buses. That is part of a comprehensive plan. Everyone is always thinking about, with great emotion about a recent tragedy, and sometimes we lose sight of the unfortunate potential for other things that are going to happen in the future. And what I unfortunately have to always say when I talk about these issues is that it's not if a tragedy will occur in your community, it's a matter of when and what type of tragedy. The coordination, you heard that very clearly from the captain, the superintendent, and from Mary Ann. Communication and coordination is key. You can have the best plan in the world, but if only the superintendent and the principal know what the plan is, it's not going to be effective. So that outreach with the community partners, they talked earlier about the threat assessment process, so I won't go, I'm not an expert on threat assessment, So I won't go into detail on that. But practicing and reviewing your plan on a regular basis is key. We have to avoid complacency. And we also have to remember that personnel changes. The superintendent changes, the building administrators change, the faculty changes, the local first responders change. So if you're not reviewing that on a regular basis, it's not going to have the effectiveness that it had when you first designed it. And once you put policies and plans in place, now I have to put on my lawyer hat, that becomes your standard of care. You would be found liable if you didn't follow the procedures and the plans that you put in place. So that's another reason. It's not just a safety issue, it is that liability concern that's out there, that you have to keep reviewing those. The 4 phases of emergency management, we'll talk a little more about them: prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, and then recovery after there has been a tragedy. You certainly have heard and have in your packets a number of the Rhode Island resources, which are excellent. I reviewed those before I came today. As school committee members, when you look at your policies, it's not one policy that talks about dealing with an emergency or dealing with a crisis. We looked at our Connecticut policies, and there are actually a total of 60 policy areas that relate to these issues. Some deal with school climate, crisis response, emergency, possession of firearms. As an aside, I will tell you, my cousin is a recently retired Rhode Island state trooper, now teaches in a high school, a non-public high school in Rhode Island. And when I saw him a month ago, I asked him about the issue of arming teachers. And his response, he still has his concealed carry permit, his response was, I look around my school building and there certainly is no one other than myself that I would want to have a gun in this building, for all the reasons that I think we heard the captain articulate. Drills, lockdown drills, shelter-in-place drills, but the important element, and again, we've heard this, Mary Ann mentioned it, we need to empower our staff to act and to deviate from whatever the plan is. They need enough information and enough training so that they feel some sense of security as to what their options are in the event of any type of crisis in their building. It's also important that when you think about training and supporting the time for training, which again, your role as school committee members is to make that time a priority, we have to think about all staff. Administrative assistants, they're the people in the front office. Bus drivers, custodians, don't just think about the building administrator and the classroom teacher as the people that need this information. Your support personnel are really as important or even more important. We did a workshop just last week, we're doing them now twice a year, for administrative office professionals in our school buildings. And the questions they ask, the concerns they have about the safety of their students and their staff would make you proud. That they recognize that they are the front line and they want to be prepared. Your safety audit has to be done in conjunction with your local emergency responders. And you can do drills when school is not in session, but certainly doing the audit, it's important to do it during school hours so that everyone can see how does this building actually operate when the students and staff are there. There have been a lot of products that I've seen advertised lately. I seem to be on a lot of email lists for things that will guarantee protections for your students. Be careful, there are charlatans, as in any area, who prey on people's fears. Make sure if you're purchasing any sort of product, get the input from your local officials. They are the experts, and you've got to rely on them in this area. Your measures for prevention are going to vary. It's going to depend upon your school, your community, what right after Sandy Hook, we had some very small communities in Connecticut that said, we are not having armed personnel in our one school building. We're not even having a school resource officer. We realize that there is a vulnerability, but this is our one community gathering place, and that's not an environment that we want to create. That was their local decision. Clearly, the needs in Providence and in Central Falls are going to be different. So how you tailor your policies will be different, but the issues that you have to think about are going to be very similar. So what types of things have districts been considering? Clearly the infrastructure issues, deterrence, detection, and delay. How many of you have visitor sign-in in your school buildings? Raise your hands. Okay, so most people are doing that now. How about some sort of video surveillance? Raise your hand. All right, more of that. Metal detectors, anyone? Yeah. We have had a couple of school districts in Connecticut that actually long before shootings in school actually installed metal detectors because of violence outside, right outside of the school building that involved the community, didn't involve any of the students, but that was their way of creating a greater sense of security within the building. Traffic patterns is something that districts are looking at. What access do people have? You know, can a car or a van with explosive devices in it easily access your school building? Unfortunately, that's something we have to think about. The mental health needs is something that I think is finally getting more attention. Clearly, many of the people, I would have to say every person who instigates a violent episode has mental health needs. Many of them have not been identified, they have not been addressed. So the better job that we can do as a community, and this is not a school-based only issue, we need to connect with our community providers. We know that with respect to budget cuts, we have fewer social workers, fewer school psychologists available to support our students. And at least in Connecticut, and I suspect it's true in Rhode Island, we are seeing more and more very young children coming to school so impacted by trauma that their behavior is well outside of the norms, and they are not able to start to learn until we can address those emotional needs. That relates to the needs of the whole school in terms of school culture and climate, and again, that's something that you'll probably address through policy, but making sure that that culture supports the connections that enable students to feel, if they're concerned about a classmate, if they overhear something, that they go to an adult in the building and share that information. We know from national studies that in most of these tragic situations involving shootings, one or more people knew or suspected that the individual involved was unstable, was likely to take violent action, and yet for a variety of reasons, that information wasn't shared or was shared and not acted upon. The community outreach, there's the balance between instilling confidence in your community that you're addressing the issues of safety and security and making sure that you're not sharing the tactical elements of your plans. And I think that as policymakers, when you have the discussion at your school committee meetings, that's the context in which you can help your community have that level of confidence. And when I talk about some of the specific policies, I'll talk about an example of communication with parents as well. School resource officers. Raise your hand if your district uses school resource officers. Okay, so the vast majority do. Clearly, and I'd be interested in your experiences, but their role in building relationships with students, in serving as a communication link, as being someone that students trust that they can go to, that is key. And therefore, making sure that that relationship is worked out often in a formal way. We highly recommend a memorandum of understanding, between the local police and the school district to make sure that we don't turn the presence of a SRO in the building into an opportunity to criminalize behavior that under your discipline policies should be handled as a referral to the building administrator, for example. There's a real key element in terms of the personality of the SRO. There are police officers that make great SROs, and there are police officers that are better suited to other aspects of police work. And so making sure that you have that good match is really what's going to be key to the success. They need to have training so they're aware of student privacy issues, what the school discipline policies are, as well as relating to students with special needs and what the communication techniques, for instance, might be that those students have. Your MOU should also address who is the supervisor of the SRO. The building administrator should certainly have a role in that supervision, even though they are sworn police officers. I'm not going to go into detail on these issues. These are things that you have to consider after there has been a tragedy. So the awareness is important. FERPA, the Federal Student Privacy Protection, does provide an exemption for health and safety in the event of an emergency. But these are very legalistic issues that your school committee attorney would advise you on if there was a tragedy. I want to talk a little bit about the issue of managing donations, because I feel compelled to do this whenever I talk on this topic. When the tragedy occurred in Newtown, people around the country and around the world wanted to support that community, and no one knew what to do. Among the things that were done were thousands of paper snowflakes that were sent to the district in December, as well as 60,000 teddy bears for a community in which only 27,000 people live, and no one had lost their homes. Everyone had, this was not a hurricane where people needed food and clothing. They had great emotional needs. Newtown was very fortunate. They had 3 loaned executives from General Electric who worked with the community full-time for a year to manage the donations. They were stored in a warehouse. The community felt very strongly that they didn't want to just send these excess donations to a landfill. So the challenge was to work out where could they be sent where they would actually be put to good use. My point in telling you this is not to make anyone feel badly if you sent teddy bears or snowflakes to Newtown, but think about what you can do for your students as they think about, we want to do something when there's a tragic event somewhere. Help them think through, what are their options? Could they have a day of caring in their own school? Could they do a food drive for the local food pantry or for the homeless shelter? How could they do something to honor these victims, but not put an additional burden on a community that is already under great stress? And it's a great lesson, I think, for young people to learn in the school environment, because as they go through life, hopefully they will be giving people who want to contribute, but it will help them develop the skills about thinking about, all right, what can I do that will actually be helpful, as opposed to what am I doing that maybe makes me feel a little better? There has been a study done by the Safe School Initiative, and there are 10 key findings. Several of them really instruct what you should be thinking about in terms of policies. That the acts of violence are rarely sudden, impulsive acts. In fact, they're often very well planned. And we know that from a number of the shootings and the information that police uncovered afterwards. Many of these attackers have difficulty coping with loss or personal failure. They have felt bullied or persecuted or harmed by others. So again, the issue when we're talking about particularly students who then act out in a violent way, the school culture and making sure that we're supportive of students is key. There are also statistics that show us that our schools have actually gotten safer over time. This slide shows the percentage of sworn law enforcement officers in schools, and that includes school resource officers. You can see that particularly in the elementary schools, that percentage has risen significantly in the past 10 years. We also see that the security measures that we've talked about, such as the ones that many of you have taken here, controlling access to buildings during school hours, using security cameras, those are all much more prevalent now than they were 10 years ago. There is an issue around, a legal issue around security cameras that would be the subject of an entire workshop for a panel of attorneys. Once you have video footage, if there is a tragedy, the local police will most likely want to access, the local or state police will want to access that video footage. You should think about having a policy in place that outlines the circumstances under which that video would be made available. Obviously, when you have that kind of surveillance, that's going to raise concerns by students and parents as to what's done with it. We've already seen in terms of videos on school buses. Who can access it? If a child is being bullied on the bus, can the parent of the victim access the video? Can the parent of the alleged perpetrator access it? So again, those are legalistic issues. Those are for another day, but just be aware that that is becoming more and more of an issue. These are just some of the Connecticut initiatives that were undertaken after Sandy Hook. We were very fortunate to have school security infrastructure grants that our state has continued to support to this day. And that has enabled districts to make some modifications to their existing buildings that enhance the safety. And again, they have to submit a plan for that, but those are very much locally determined depending upon the needs of their building. One of the remarkable things after the tragedy at Sandy Hook was the outreach from colleagues around the country. The tragedy happened on a Friday morning. Friday afternoon and Saturday morning, I had contacts from our colleagues at the National School Boards Association, the Council of School Attorneys, and others around the country. Everyone offered their sincere support, not at their hourly billable rate in terms of the attorneys. They simply wanted to help. And I was actually able to put the attorney for the Newtown Board of Education in contact with another attorney across the country who had represented clients who had faced a similar tragedy. So that network of support really is a remarkable thing. And you heard Jake talk about within the region the support, but it is national as well. And you are not alone if you face one of these tragedies. You can certainly expect that there will be outreach to you, and you should feel free to reach out to anyone. There are a couple of observations that Ken Trump, who I actually was on a panel with as part of the Council of School Attorneys at the most recent NSBA convention, and I just leave you with some of his comments. The final one there, school crisis teams have to plan, prepare, and practice. Dusty crisis plans on shelves are not worth the paper they are written on. So if there's a takeaway from today, from me, I would say, while it is not possible to prevent every emergency, your preparation and collaboration can certainly mitigate the harm that your community, your students, your staff will feel. I want to turn now to take you through a couple of the policies that are in the packet. They're on the right-hand side, I think. And again, these are Connecticut policies, so feel free to use them as a tool to compare to what you already have in place. Just be forewarned, they refer to school boards, and they cite Connecticut statutes. So don't take it and put it in your policy manual. Our policy service has had the experience of Connecticut districts, I won't name districts, but you know where you have the line in the policy where they're supposed to fill in the name of the district? They leave the line blank. And I'm thinking, I'm not really sure you read through the policy. I'm a little uncomfortable because the point is not to get it adopted, the point is to understand what you're acting on. So the first policy is under students and talks about student safety, and it goes through putting an emphasis on a safe and secure learning environment. It's the opportunity for the board to make its statement about the importance of safety in the buildings, talking about doing regular assessments, and also talking about other elements that we've mentioned, the code of conduct, the positive climate, making sure the plans are reviewed and audited on a regular basis. I understand in Rhode Island that needs to be every 3 years. You at the local level may feel you want to do that more frequently than every 3 years. Communicating with parents and community members. Making sure there's the partnership with local law enforcement and other local community agencies. Establishing a school security and safety committee, and I know there was discussion about who should be on that. And also, in Connecticut, we're required to have a safe school climate committee as well. I don't know, is that a Rhode Island requirement? We seem to just keep building on extra layers in Connecticut. I have to confess that having spent the last 3 nights with our state legislature, and I'll go back there this afternoon, they adjourn on May 9th. We have a short session this year. I was really excited to be coming here to hopefully help people do something positive in their communities, because I can't say that's exactly what's been going on in Hartford. You're supposed to laugh and be sympathetic, okay? You feel my pain? Okay, all right. I know, you have a full-time, no, Massachusetts has the full-time legislature. Yeah, that's worse. The next policy talks about crisis response, and again, the actual details of these plans will be in the hands of your superintendent and your administration. And even as a school committee member, you are not necessarily going to be aware of every element of that plan, because if you know, that might be one person too many. So this policy talks about the role of the crisis response team and the elements that they need to be considering as they undertake their work. Making sure that they're addressing things like evacuation, lockdown, shelter in place. All elements that you never know when you're going to need them, and all elements that sometimes, we practice the fire drill, we practice the evacuation drill. How often do we practice the lockdown? How often do we practice shelter in place? Think about that and making that part of your routine procedure. We also talk about, in this policy, it talks about the importance of having a spokesperson. The superintendent indicated that he wanted to immediately be able to get out information, because that's the expectation of parents now. Everything is immediate. Fast is not always best. And fortunately, the captain cautioned him that, no, let's wait until we've got control of the situation before we start communicating with an unknown universe about the situation. Having a single spokesperson is usually a good idea. We've seen some examples recently at the federal level where multiple voices sometimes give inconsistent messages. That does not instill confidence in the community. We just had a fire and explosion in a community near where I live in Connecticut, and it was both the first selectman and the chief of police that served as the spokespeople. They had a similar message. They conveyed a sense of great confidence that this was an isolated incident, it was a domestic dispute, and the situation was under control and the community should feel safe. But that clear voice really makes a difference. The next policy I want you to take a look at is the one, it's entitled Instruction, and it's 6114A. And what this includes at the end of the policy is a sample letter to parents, giving them some information about your safety plans, addressing some issues that the superintendent raised, such as where will the student, in the event of an emergency, where will the students be evacuated to? Where can you go to reconnect with your children? That's important information, and I think, again, you're going to want to tailor this to your own community and your own expectations of your parents in terms of amount of information. But I think looking through these elements would give you a good idea of, you know, what would be appropriate things to be saying to parents. And again, you're going to want to communicate this probably every year or have it available on your website, because, you know, people get the letter when their children enter kindergarten, and 3 years later, if there's a need to evacuate the building, first of all, they haven't kept the letter. Secondly, they don't remember what the letter says. So again, making sure that you keep those communications fresh. And then finally, the policy on safe schools that talks about an advisory committee that would be in place on an ongoing basis. And this can include not just school board members, but importantly, staff and other community officials, so that you make sure that there's really a process where you keep looking at these issues, where you look at new technology that's available, where you look at new strategies for supporting students and staff when there's been any sort of crisis, the loss of a faculty member, a tragedy within the greater community. Those are all things that you should have in place, and have a body that has the responsibility to keep looking at those issues. And finally, the issue of athletic events. There can be, you know, the terrible tragic incident. There can also be the unsportsmanlike conduct. And I will confess, in Connecticut, we have had more than our share of unsportsmanlike conduct. So again, providing training for staff, but also for students. How do you de-escalate a situation? How do we get back to a more civil discourse? That's actually another resolution that NSBA adopted this year, that we had adopted in Connecticut last fall. But how do we help people have a rational conversation, a rational disagreement, a healthy sports competition without it resulting in a situation that ranges from uncomfortable to potentially violent? And finally, at the back of that policy, there's an appendix that outlines the components of school and school district emergency management plans. It's from a national publication. And again, it's a tool for you to look at, where are you? These are important elements, and it lets you consider, do we have this in place? Are we working on it? When do we expect to have it in place? So it's a good checklist as you go through and think about, what are you doing in your communities? With that, I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I do realize that I am between you and lunch, and I've been between hungry school committee members and school board members before, so I know it's a little dangerous. Yep. Do that.
Questions? Thank you. Dave Tester from Warwick. Just a quick question on SROs. If a school district opts not to have one, do you think there's a liability, God forbid, if something happens in that building, that they opted not to have an SRO?
I don't think it increases your liability. There are financial reasons that districts don't have SROs. There are climate issues that schools don't have SROs. There are resource issues with your local police departments. I live in a community where we have 2 high schools, 8 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and our police department has said, we don't have the personnel, we can't get enough people through the police academy to provide those resources. So, as I always say to school committee members, and school board members, can someone sue you if something happens? Absolutely, they probably will, but no, I don't think you increase your exposure. You increase your exposure if you haven't thought about the issues. So if you haven't gone through well, would this make sense in our building? Maybe, maybe not. All right, if we're not going to have an SRO, what other things are we doing to make sure that we're providing a secure environment, a safe climate?
There are 2 bills currently in the House, our legislature, that would mandate SROs. One from Representative Amore, who's a teacher in East Providence, and the other one is from Representative Phillips. Part of the problem is they don't really know where to assign the cost. Does the cost go to the school district? Does it go to the police department?
Yeah.
And as Patrice mentioned, I think it's Exeter or West Greenwich, or I'm not sure. There is one city in the state, one town in the state that does not actually have a police department. And the state police actually patrol there.
Hi, I had a question about the video monitoring. So that's coming up that there's not really anybody to be watching the video monitoring in the school, right? Because we don't have the resources.
Right.
And so then the question had become, should that then go to the police department, that the police department is monitoring it? That makes me uncomfortable, primarily for what you talked about the criminalization of a school environment. Is there a place to look for guidance about that? Is there best practice? I would appreciate any resources.
You know, I don't have a good answer to that, but I will look into it on Monday and I'll get something to Tim that he can then disseminate, okay? I share your concern twofold. Sending it to the police department as just part of a regular video feed, do they have the personnel to be monitoring it? And if they are monitoring it, I think you would increase the criminalization of behaviors that you're handling within the building.
Patrice, I want to go back to the SRO question. So in our community, we have 2, one at the middle school and one at the high school. They are appointed by the police chief, but they work in our buildings, and the question has to do with supervision and evaluation. And so I have what I think is a pretty standard job description that is probably several years old. But in no place does it address that, you know, this is a town employee working in a school building, and who's responsible for making sure that this person is kind of doing their job the way we would like to see it done, I suppose.
I think that those are the SRO situation, I think it's a joint responsibility. Clearly, because they are a sworn police officer, an employee of the police department, the chief of police has a role in their supervision and evaluation. But they are in your building. Now, some SROs are in a building, 2 hours every day. Some are there full time. There's a whole variation in terms of the work of SROs. But I do think that the building principal needs to also have input into that evaluation and has to have supervisory responsibility while the SRO is in your building.
Thank you.
Next question. I'll tell you that in North Providence, the city is addressing the question of the SRO in the high school by building the police station directly across from the high school. But not everybody can do that, so.
Right.
Any more questions? Let me just say one thing. That several of our speakers have mentioned that only about half of the school districts in the state have filed their school safety plans. And in that sense, it falls on the folks here today to go back to the school district and ask that pointed question of the school superintendent. Where do we stand with the school safety plan? Or better yet, put it as an agenda item on the next school committee meeting. And if they haven't gotten the plan up to speed, they'll get it up to speed by the next school committee meeting, almost guaranteed.